San Means we got shots fired at 4:15 a.m. Route 91. Sounded like an automatic firearm.
Copy, code red at 169 San Means. You have shots fired.
179 San Means coming from upstairs in the Mandalay Bay. Upstairs in Mandalay Bay, halfway up. I see the shots coming from Mandalay Bay. Halfway up.
Control 361 IC. We have multiple 415 breaks. Give me a surge.
We have an active shooter. We have an active shooter inside the warehouse.
Control, that is correct. Shots fired from Mandalay Bay. There's many people down. Stage left. Just be advised.
CP, I need eyes. Somebody in the CP, can you tell me where it's coming from?
We're headed from Mandalay Bay.
Somewhere at Mandalay Bay. It's at the intersection. It almost sounds like it's that close.
It sounded like an elevated position that they had.
790 arrived. I'm going to form a strike team. Mandalay Bay and the Boulevard. I need 5 officers on me.
We have multiple casualties. GSW's at the medical tent. Multiple casualties.
Control, be advised. Shots are coming from gate 7. Gate 7. Shots are coming from gate 7.
159 SC. We have a rifle deployed. We're in front of Mandalay Bay. We're trying to see where the shots are coming from. If anyone can advise if they're coming from Mandalay.
It sounds like it's either Mandalay or Luxor. We cannot tell.
From Mandalay Bay, it's getting a little bit more faint.
159 is coming from like the 50th or 60th floor. North of the Mandalay Bay. It's coming out a window. So if you're there, man, Officer Scott, Mandalay Bay northbound. Right outside Route 91 is the south end. 14. I'm inside the Mandalay Bay on the 31st floor. I can hear the automatic fire coming from one floor ahead. One floor above us.
Repeat, just be advised. It is automatic fire. Fully automatic fire from an elevated position. Take cover.
That is correct. It's fully automatic fire. I'm right below it. Control, we need all units stop coming northbound on Las Vegas Boulevard because he's shooting this way. It's a horrible cover spot. We're just north of Mandalay Bay Drive, east of the boulevard. We got about 40 to 50 people. We're pinned against this wall. Right. We're taking gunfire. It's going right over our heads. There's debris coming over our heads. So we're pinned down here with a bunch of civilians. Hey, we can't worry about victims. We need to stop the shooter before we have more victims. Anybody have eyes on this shooter? About 15 floor on the Mandalay Bay, facing a whole lot.
Welcome to Truth and Consequences with Doug Poppa, episode number 19 for October 1st, 2020. The October 1st, 2017 Las Vegas Massacre was the result of incompetence and negligence. 3 years ago, the worst mass shooting in United States history occurred in Las Vegas, Nevada. Gunman Stephen Paddock opened fire from his 32nd floor suite at the Mandalay Bay Hotel and Casino and fired for over 10 minutes into the crowd at the Route 91 Harvest Music Festival across Las Vegas Boulevard from the Mandalay Bay Hotel. When the gunshots ceased that night, 58 people were dead and almost 500 more were wounded by the gunfire. I authored over 135 stories on the massacre, more than any other single investigative journalist in the country, and broke many stories which went mostly ignored by the mainstream media. When I wrote that the civil action filed by attorneys for the victims would never see the light of day in a courtroom, I was ridiculed, until a year later, what I predicted turned out to be true. The Las Vegas Massacre was foreseeable, predictable, and preventable. I said that over and over again. It was for those reasons which I hammered down in one story after another that led me to believe early on that the civil action would end up with a quick out-of-court settlement. The $800 million settlement, in my opinion, was a fraction of what it should have been. The command personnel at the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department and MGM Resorts International, the owners of the Mandalay Bay Hotel and the fairgrounds where the music festival occurred, were, in my opinion, in addition to the gunman, both responsible for the tragedy because of poor leadership in both of those organizations and a failure to foresee the incident. In July of 2019, Clark County Sheriff Joe Lombardo, who runs the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department, released the department's after-action review of the massacre to the public. It was nothing short of a disgrace. The Las Vegas media praised the report. They gave credit to Lombardo and his staff for lessons learned from the massacre. Yes, lessons learned from the death of 58 concert-goers. That is really something to be proud of, when in reality, Sheriff Lombardo and his command staff were asleep at the wheel for years. Lombardo didn't deserve credit for crap. He failed miserably. Because of Lombardo's incompetence and negligence, it took the death of 58 people and the wounding of almost 500 others for him and his team of professionals to finally agree that what they should have had in place prior to the October 1st massacre was not in place. Great lesson learned, Sheriff Lombardo. I'm sure the families of the dead and the survivors took great comfort in that. One Las Vegas media outlet quoted Lombardo's predecessors, former Clark County Sheriffs Bill Young and Doug Gillespie, who called Lombardo, quote, a tactical mastermind, unquote. I found that to be really humorous. I wonder if they were both sober when they made that remark. Lombardo's lack of leadership skills and his failure to protect the public on October 1st, 2017, equates to Lombardo being a tactical imbecile, not a mastermind. Lombardo once again bamboozled the public. Regardless of what the after-action review says, the massacre was foreseeable, predictable, and entirely preventable, both on the LVMPD and MGMRI's part. What Lombardo did by publishing that report was diverting attention away from his piss-poor leadership and his failure to keep the public safe on October 1st, 2017. Notwithstanding the attacks of 9/11, Mumbai, Boston, and all the other terrorist attacks and active shooter incidents that have occurred in this country prior to October 1st, 2017, the following two little items of noteworthiness, in my humble opinion, lead me to the conclusion that October 1st was entirely foreseeable and predictable. A former ranking member of the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department told me in 2017 that MGM Resorts International Executive Director of Corporate Security and Surveillance, Tom Lozich, knew prior to the October 1st, 2017 massacre that a sniper attack from an elevated position in a hotel high-rise posed a threat. Lozich is a retired deputy chief with the LVMPD. In 2008, he was hired by MGM Mirage Corporation, which is now known as MGMRI. According to the police source, Lozich, while employed at MGM, was present during a training exercise when an FBI sniper shot a mannequin placed inside a window simulating a sniper at a hotel high-rise. I was told that a training exercise conducted by the FBI's elite hostage rescue team and attended by members of the LVMPD was eerily similar to the sniper attack from an elevated position that occurred on October 1st, 2017. Sometime after the Sahara Hotel in Las Vegas closed in May 2011, and prior to renovations to transform the property into the SLS Resort, the property was used for a training exercise conducted by the FBI and LVMPD personnel. I was told by several other sources that in addition to LVMPD and FBI personnel, there were also some security professionals from the Las Vegas hotel industry also in attendance. This was also confirmed to me by a member of the LVMPD SWAT team. During the training exercise, a mannequin was placed inside one of the high-rise tower rooms near a window to simulate an attacker. The FBI sniper, who was inside an FBI helicopter hovering over the Las Vegas Strip, successfully made the shot and hit the mannequin. This raises some serious questions as to why there weren't LVMPD snipers deployed during the Route 91 Music Festival. Not only were the LVMPD and the FBI aware that a threat existed from an elevated sniper attack in a hotel high-rise, hence the training exercise, but there was also an MGM Resorts International security executive present. Why wasn't this threat a concern, not only for the LVMPD, but was this raised by MGMRI corporate security executive Lozich during the planning stages of the inaugural Route 91 Music Festival in October of 2014? The concert venue property is owned by MGMRI, and the venue is surrounded by hotel high-rise towers. 1 month after the first Route 91 Music Festival, this incident occurred. On November 29, 2014, a housekeeping attendant entered a room in one of the high-rise towers at the Mandalay Bay Hotel. an MGM-RI-owned property, and according to court documents that I obtained, noticed a rifle with the scope lying on the floor pointing towards the Las Vegas Strip. Security was contacted and the LVMPD responded. A convicted felon, Kai Aaron Dunbar, and his wife were occupying the room. The police confiscated a homemade suppressor, commonly referred to as a silencer, 3 handguns, 2 .223 caliber semi-automatic rifles, and a 7.62 NATO caliber bolt-action rifle. No doubt MGM Resorts International corporate security knew about this incident, as well as the LVMPD and the FBI. Less than 3 years later, Stephen Paddock brought 23 firearms and thousands of rounds of ammunition into his Mandalay Bay hotel suite and initiated a sniper attack from his elevated position in one of the hotel high-rise towers of the Mandalay Bay and fired down into the concert venue, resulting in the worst mass shooting in modern American history. Lombardo was sheriff on the night of October 1st, 2017, and prior to being elected in 2014, Lombardo held the titles of the assistant sheriff and deputy chief. He and his staff had 15 years to prepare for October 1st, and Lombardo failed miserably, and as a result, people died. It was bad enough that the LVMPD didn't deploy snipers at the inaugural Route 91 festival in October 2014 after attending that FBI sniper scenario training, but then right after that, they had the incident in the Mandalay Bay Hotel with the felon's small arsenal in one of the high-rise tower rooms, and even that didn't smack some sense into Lombardo or his staff, because snipers were never deployed at the 2015, 2016, and 2017 Route 91 Harvest Music Festivals. Do you know what that told me about Sheriff Joe Lombardo? Neither Lombardo nor his team of professionals didn't think outside the box. Nobody planned for the what-ifs, and that led to the Las Vegas Massacre. It is extremely sad that nobody at the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department and MGM Resorts International that was involved with the planning of any of the Route 91 Harvest Music Festivals thought outside the box, that just maybe the open-air concert venue could be vulnerable from a sniper attack from an elevated position. What I found rather interesting is that none of that was mentioned by Lombardo in his after-action review that he released last year. I wonder why that is. I know, forget about it, cover it up, be non-transparent, and move on. I know 58 people who never had a chance to move on with their life. In a June 6, 2011 Security Magazine article, Tom Lozich was quoted as saying, "My days are now spent thinking about prevention because just one event along the Strip could have catastrophic effects for the entire economic vitality of the state," unquote. He wrote that 5 years prior to the Las Vegas Massacre while he was employed by MGM-RI. The Route 91 Harvest Music Festival had a catastrophic effect on human lives, and that is something you cannot put a price on. In May of 2018, I interviewed former U.S. Navy SEAL Matt Bracken. Bracken told me, quote, "This was an entirely foreseeable and preventable massacre," Bracken said. "The prior FBI exercise proves this scenario had been considered. A police helicopter with the SWAT sniper should have been ready to go. The airborne sniper could have stopped Paddock after the first couple of minutes, saving dozens of lives and preventing the panic stampede. For that matter, counter-snipers on the ground could have fired into the broken-out windows to force Paddock back into the room and stopped him from firing down the concert," Braddock stated. Braddock was correct in his thinking because according to Lombardo's after-action review, quote, "A SWAT sniper team was deployed in an LVMPD helicopter hoping to confront the shooter. It was difficult for the helicopter to get close enough to the Mandalay Bay window to observe the shooter." My comment, the only problem was that they did not deploy until after Paddock stopped firing. Had they been in place as Bracken suggested they should have been, the loss of life could have been greatly diminished. Lombardo's after-action review also states, quote, "SWAT officers who responded carried sniper rifles and protective equipment and were thus more protected and prepared than officers who were working the festival," unquote. Yes, They would have been prepared to take out Paddock had they been deployed in the vicinity of the concert venue, but they weren't. On October 5th, 2017, KLAS-TV 8 News Now said that almost 6 years prior to the massacre, the LVMPD quietly instituted the so-called MACTAC approach to active shooter scenarios. In dramatic training exercises, every officer on the force became part of the plan to aggressively identify and neutralize a wide variety of threats, from a lone wolf shooter in a shopping mall or a sniper on the stratosphere to a coordinated attack by a terrorist militia. Plans were developed, according to 8 News Now, for how to deal with multiple threat scenarios at every hotel on the Las Vegas Strip and every other potential target in the valley. The plan was kicked into high gear, 8 News Now reported, in part because the deadly assault in Mumbai, India, but the department continued to adapt its plan. I would have loved to see all those plans, because Lombardo failed miserably on the night of October 1st, 2017, and his after-action review confirms that. So what's going on here? So, plans were developed for how to deal with multiple threat scenarios at every hotel on the Las Vegas Strip. Lombardo doesn't have to show me all the plans, just show me the one for the Mandalay Bay Hotel, because I'm perplexed why the full SWAT team never made entry into Paddock's suite and why no police officers entered his room until 1 hour and 5 minutes after Paddock fired his last shots. Lombardo told George Knapp from 8 News Now in November of 2017 that the police had to make entry because they didn't want Paddock reloading or opening fire again, yet nobody entered the room until 11:20 p.m. that night. Once again, Joe Lombardo lied to the public, and George Knapp allowed him to get away with that remark on television because he never followed up. He knew that it was a lie, and he moved on to another question. Another example of the Las Vegas media at its finest. Considering the magnitude of what occurred that night, the officers who arrived on the 32nd floor, whether they believe Paddock was barricaded or not, should have at least attempted entry into his room. Just as Lombardo said, he didn't want Paddock reloading or opening fire again, but that didn't happen. But as we know, that never happened until 1 hour and 5 minutes after the firing had stopped. Excerpts from the after-action report. Quote, mass casualty incident plan. Listen to this. At the time of this incident, policy was not in place specifically for a mass casualty incident response, unquote. My comment on that? That is so freaking unbelievable to me that it doesn't even justify, out of respect for those killed and injured on October 1st, further comment. Lombardo, that alone should be enough to throw you the hell out of office. Another quote from the report. It was clear from interviews not all levels of leadership knew what was expected of them, unquote. My comment? Lombardo, you can spin that any way you want in your report. That is another disgrace because you only found that out after the worst shooting in American history. Too bad people had to die for you to figure out that your supervisors did not know what was expected of them during a mass casualty incident. Very sad indeed. Another quote from his after-action review. As with many agencies, LVMPD studied the events in Mumbai, Boston, and the Columbine High School, as well as the attacks of 9/11 on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. Despite those reviews and lessons, policies were not sufficiently robust to handle the magnitude of what happened on October 1st, unquote. My comment. One active shooter firing from an elevated position in a hotel high-rise for over 10 minutes on October 1st, 2017, and the policies were not sufficiently robust to handle the magnitude of what was happening. Great job, Lombardo. Good thing it wasn't a Mumbai-type terrorist attack with multiple assailants that night, because obviously Lombardo wouldn't have been prepared for that also. Lombardo, didn't Mumbai happen in 2008, 9 years prior to the October 1st, 2017 massacre? Shame on you and your staff for not being prepared. Another quote. At LVMPD, we pride ourselves on being a learning organization, unquote. My comment on that? Lombardo didn't learn a damn thing from anything that happened prior to October 1st, 2017. Only after the carnage did he learn that he failed. Why your incompetent butt is still sitting in the office of Clark County Sheriff is beyond imagination. Another thing, Lombardo, you covered up for LVMPD officer CORDELL HENDREX for months, until I broke that story, and then defended him after the court-ordered records and body cam videos were released to the public, and we found out the truth. Another reason to boot you right out of headquarters and onto Martin Luther King Boulevard in Las Vegas. Lombardo, telling the public what you learned after the October 1st attack is a cop-out, no pun intended. It's a cover-your-ass reaction to a tragedy. Lombardo, your incompetence, negligence, lack of leadership, and as you like to say, quote, malpractice, unquote, led to the massacre. You have nothing to be proud of. Quote, LVMPD is a unique police agency in that its leader, the sheriff, is an elected official whose authorization emanates from the electorate. That is from the after-action review, unquote. My comment, elected public officers in the state of Nevada are subject to recall from office by the registered voters of the state, county, district, or municipality from which he or she was elected. Another quote from his report. With law enforcement closing in, the shooter took his own life, unquote. My comment, Lombardo, that's correct. Only one person stopped Stephen Paddock that night, and that was Paddock himself. Officers closing in? Really, Lombardo? You got the nerve to put that in the report? What about HENDREX, who was already closed in, along with his force multiplier, as you like to say, of 3 Mandalay Bay Hotel armed assistant security managers, and they all retreated, did nothing. Directly above them on the 32nd floor were 3 more armed Mandalay Bay Hotel armed security personnel, who also did nothing as Paddock continued his firing unimpeded. Lombardo, how many more people were being killed and wounded as this armed force multiplier, as you call it, contingent, failed to act to save lives? And now you know why I said earlier that the civil action would never make it to court? Can you imagine what the settlement Can you imagine what the settlement may have been if a civil jury was listening to all of this in court? Another quote from Lombardo's after-action report. As the final country music act took the stage, ending the 3-day festival, Stephen C. Paddock fired rounds into the crowd in excess of 22,000 attendees. The gunfire began at approximately 10:05 p.m. and continued for over 10 minutes, with an excess of 1,000 rounds fired from various rifles from the 32nd floor of the Mandalay Bay Resort and Casino, unquote. My comment on that. Thanks, Lombardo, for that revelation. However, I think we're all quite aware of what happened that night because of your incompetence and negligence, and that of your friend, former MGMRI CEO Jim Murren, who allowed Paddock to bring his arsenal of death into the Mandalay Bay Hotel. What we do know is that during those excesses of 1,000 rounds being fired, Lombardo, because of your lack of leadership, there were no police officers prepared to counter Paddock's gunfire. Murren, your director of corporate security, was at that FBI sniper scenario, and he later made the remark to a now retired high-ranking member of the LVMPD who spoke to me, and he said that Lozich said that he would never train for an incident like that at his hotel and that he would absorb the liability if something like that happened. Guess what, Murren? As you know, something like that did happen on October 1st, 2017, and that is why your corporation, without a shadow of a doubt, absorbed the liability through the insurance company, settled out of court, because you also, just like the LVMPD, had foreseeability. Another quote from Lombardo's after-action review. The incident tested the capabilities of LVMPD in new and different ways. The unfolding events were unpredictable and unprecedented. While adequately planning and preparing for an event of such magnitude and scope may seem impractical, the agency had been working toward preparedness, training, and planning for many years, unquote. My comment, Lombardo, a mass casualty event that you were not prepared for. Prior incidents and training alone dictate it was not unpredictable and unprecedented, as you said, and therefore that in itself negates everything you say in your report. Another quote from Lombardo's report. The site of 1 October was similar to many open-air events held across the country. My comment, yes, Lombardo, it may have been similar. However, some agencies would have handled it much differently than you did. According to a police source who spoke to me after the Las Vegas Massacre, a Dallas, Texas SWAT sniper told the LVMPD during a training exercise that based on Dallas SWAT team criteria, that if the Route 91 Harvest Music Festival had occurred in Dallas, that their SWAT team would have been deployed during the event. Lombardo, how come you didn't mention that in your review? As I have repeatedly said in numerous articles that I authored several years ago, Lombardo, that you should have had SWAT snipers on standby in the area of Route 91. They would have saved lives that night. All the taxpayer money for training and equipment for your SWAT teams over the years, and the one night that they were truly needed by Las Vegas citizens and tourists, they were not there. Why? Because you failed to deploy them in the area. Lombardo, the snipers would have had their crosshairs on Paddock. They would have been on that piece of human garbage so fast, just like a fly on feces. Another quote. As the number of active shooter incidents grows annually around the world, the more we share within the field, the better position we are to respond effectively to the scene and to victims, their families, and the community at large, unquote. My comment on that one. Lombardo, so it takes more active shooter incidents for you to learn, which you should have learned many years ago. Another quote from his report. In our chosen profession of policing, we often cannot control what takes place on the ground that we have been commissioned to protect and serve, unquote. Comment. Lombardo, you could have controlled what was taking place on the ground had you deployed counter snipers. They would have taken control of the situation. Within a minute of Paddock opening fire, officers on the ground said over the radio that the shots were coming from the Mandalay Bay halfway up. Not to mention, Lombardo, but the story I broke back in 2018, that again was ignored by the Las Vegas media, that 1 minute into the massacre, a police detective observed Paddock with the rifle firing from the window. Another quote from his report. In 1987, several security directors of downtown properties formed the Las Vegas Security Chiefs Association. Its mission was to promote security professionalism and enhance communications between one another and with law enforcement agencies in the community, unquote. Quote, it became difficult to hear and transmit over the radio due to inadequate radio coverage inside some hotel properties, unquote. My comment on that. Glad you also brought that up, Lombardo, in your after-action review. Did anybody in security management at the Mandalay Bay Hotel ever communicate to the LVMPD that radio reception was a problem inside their hotel? Lombardo, how many Metro officers have been responding to calls for service inside the Mandalay Bay Hotel since it was opened? I find it hard to believe that the radio communication problem started on the night of October 1st, 2017 with the Mandalay Bay and other hotels, as you stated. It appears to have been a lack of communication, no pun intended, or nobody gave a crap until people were killed and wounded. Let us not forget all the stories I authored that raised questions about Mandalay Bay Hotel security procedures, policies, and training prior to the Las Vegas Massacre. Not to mention that the Vice President of Security at the Mandalay Bay Hotel at the time of the massacre, George Tagliati, was a retired FBI agent. Apparently his prior expertise didn't make one bit of difference considering all the problems within his own security department. And let us not forget that one of the mediators involved in the settlement with the victims' attorneys was no other than his own daughter, former District Court Judge Jennifer Tagliati. I'm sure there was no conflict of interest there. Let's continue on with Lombardo's after-action review. Quote, in the spring of 2017, MGM Resorts developed an Emergency Response Team, ERT, program. This program provides specialized armed emergency response team officers who complement existing security programs. An emergency response team responds immediately before law enforcement arrives, unquote. My comment on that. Thanks for bringing this one up, Lombardo. An executive of MGMRI told a security consultant after the massacre, who spoke to me, and I wrote about this, that the Mandalay Bay Hotel had an emergency response team in place prior to October 1st, 2017. As I previously reported, the problem was, though, the Mandalay Bay Hotel emergency response team was nowhere to be found on the night of October 1st, as Paddock was firing for over 10 minutes from inside his 32nd floor suite. Another quote from Lombardo's report. In the aftermath of October 1st, LVMPD leadership and the private sector hotel industry held conversations about the tourist corridor of the Las Vegas Strip. The discussions centered on the responsibility of private sector partners to maintain and train hotel and casino security personnel to safely address violent threats on their properties. As of the completion of this report, numerous Las Vegas Strip properties, including several MGM resorts, have implemented this program and trained employees in active shooter response for the respective hotels and casinos, unquote. Excuse me, I get some water, my throat's killing me. Stop covering for the casino industry, Lombardo. Prior to the Las Vegas Massacre, after the attacks of September 11, 2001, numerous training seminars were available free of charge to the industry from the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and other agencies. I attended many of those trainings as Director of Security seminars, along with my supervisors, and in attendance were many security professionals from MGMRI. The industry was told for years to implement security measures to deter an incident just like what occurred on October 1st, 2017. They failed to do so, and people died. Another quote from Lombardo's after-action review. The role of Clark County Sheriff is all the more challenging with the addition of political responsibilities, such as being concerned with the economic stability of the region, unquote. That is a very interesting comment. How far does your political responsibilities concerned for big money go, Lombardo? Far enough to have covered for MGMRI? Lombardo, I'm not blowing smoke up your ass with that question, but there are a few things that bother me. When your detective was interviewing Mandalay Bay security officer Jesus Campos after the massacre, I could never understand why, when Campos told him that after he saw the bracket drilled into the 32nd floor fire stairwell door, heard drilling noises coming from inside Paddock's suite, and then just walked away without investigating or calling it in. The detective never asked Campos why he just walked away and ignored it. I read those reports. That's documented. That's called security negligence on MGMRI's side and Campos. Lombardo, Campos should have been grilled on that by your detective. Was the reason because further questioning would have been civilly damaging to MGMRI? Just another reason why MGMRI wanted to settle out of court, just like I stated. Lombardo, remember when ABC News' Nightline ran their story on the Las Vegas Massacre? What I found really troubling, Lombardo, was that they also interviewed Campos, and guess what? They missed the mark on that too. Could that be just a coincidence? Lombardo, was it also a coincidence that Nightline did not report on CORDELL HENDREX? One of your deputy chiefs was interviewed, but no mention of HENDREX and security failing to act to save lives on Nightline. I even wrote a story about that. In the after-action review under the subtitle Crime Scene Photograph, it states this, quote, LVMPD and the FBI collected thousands of photographs to aid in the criminal investigation. The FBI stored these photographs. Based on interviews conducted with the FBI, it was estimated that over 20,000 hours of video and over 250,000 images were collected and taken from numerous locations, and 40 terabytes of digital evidence was recovered from one location alone, unquote. Glad you brought this one up. To Lombardo, I said in your report, I wonder if we will, okay, let me say that again. What am I saying over here? Glad you brought this one up too, Lombardo. Okay? I wonder if we will ever see these thousands of photographs and all the video that the FBI has in their possession, as you stated. Haven't seen it to this day, and it's 3 years later. And as far as the 40 terabytes of digital evidence you quote that was taken, recovered from one location, an MGMRI employee told me those were all the hard drives and the DVRs from the surveillance video, both from security surveillance and the gaming surveillance at the Mandalay Bay. Lombardo, I noticed in your report that you failed to mention anything about the police personnel who leaked the Paddock crime scene photographs to the press after the massacre, thus compromising the criminal investigation of the worst mass shooting in American history. Must have been an oversight on your part again. I'm sure you're not intentionally being non-transparent and covering things up, as you have a history of doing. Lombardo, we're still pondering how much money one of your own staff got for those Paddock photographs. Not to mention that your own homicide detectives were not allowed to investigate the death of Stephen Paddock, that the crime scene, including Paddock's body, was compromised and moved prior to the arrival of the crime scene analyst, and so much more that I reported on 3 years ago. Lombardo, your own homicide department also compromised the criminal investigation of the still unsolved 2016 Land Kaufman double homicide by releasing details of that investigation to Las Vegas Justice Court Judge Melanie Aristobiason. I don't care what the local newspapers reporting from that bullshit report from her attorneys. Tobiason did meddle into that investigation, and you know it. And I'm going to keep on proving it as I go along. One of your own homicide detectives even sent a text message to Connie Land, the mother of Sidney Land, one of the victims in that almost 4-year unsolved double homicide, telling her that the case was in effect botched and they had to pick up the pieces. Unbelievable. Not to forget, Lombardo, that your corrupt vice detectives failed to follow up on valid information that you yourself confirmed was provided by Judge Tobiason, and because they failed to act on it, you later had a murder. I just did that podcast yesterday. And the gutless Las Vegas media that you apparently have influence over refused to report on all of this. Yes, Lombardo, under your leadership, you are running one hell of a department. Now back to Lombardo's after-action review. Another quote. Because of prior working relationships, the response from numerous law enforcement agencies and officers working together to terminate the threat proved extraordinary, unquote. My comment, really, Lombardo? Extraordinary? The threat was self-terminated by Paddock. 2 of your officers and 6 armed Mandalay Bay security personnel were within feet of his room and did nothing, while Paddock continued to fire unimpeded and killing and wounding without anyone intervening. Another quote from the report. Patience, skill, and coordination with partners led to the eventual location and identification of the shooter, unquote. My comment on that. Mandalay Bay security knew the exact location of the shooter almost immediately after he opened fire. That's confirmed by radio traffic. Don't forget your detective, Lombardo, who saw Paddock firing out the window and, quote, from the radio traffic, 179 SC, it's coming from upstairs in the Mandalay Bay Resort Casino halfway up. I see the shots coming from halfway up, unquote. And of course, HENDREX, VARSIN, and their force multiplier contingent of armed security personnel on the 31st and 32nd floor. And what good did all of this do? Not a damn thing, because Paddock continued to kill and wound unimpeded. Another quote from Lombardo's bullshit after-action report. Quote, the officer from events planning who coordinated the event had assigned 8 rifle-certified officers to the perimeter of the venue with staggering start times, unquote. Lombardo, I do believe you misinformed the public with that one too. What good were rifle-certified officers if they weren't even carrying their rifles and had to run over 1 block to their vehicles to get the rifles, which were locked in the trunk of their police vehicles when the firing started? Please explain that. Could it be, as I was told by several of your officers, that you cannot fathom the idea of Metro officers carrying the rifles in public because it's not politically correct? Lombardo, the only thing that is not politically correct here is you as Sheriff of Clark County. Another quote from Lombardo's report. On January 19, 2018, Sheriff Lombardo released a preliminary investigative report with the facts known to investigators at the time. On August 3, 2018, the criminal investigative report was released to the public. For the purpose of this after-action review, the Criminal Investigative Report was used to establish a sequence of events and confirm facts pertaining to the criminal investigation, unquote. Boy, do I have comments on this. Lombardo, I'm sure you are aware, as I have pointed out in several articles that I authored back then, that both of those reports had false, misleading, and contradictory information in them. Apparently, nobody vetted them for accuracy. For instance, just to point out a few, Paddock being in the casino playing slots at the same time somebody was accessing his room. Or the bellman who brought his luggage up to Paddock's room after the report said he brought the luggage up by himself. But don't worry about it, Lombardo. They weren't that important. They just happened to be the criminal investigative reports on the worst mass shooting in modern American history and the largest homicide investigation in the history of the LVMPD. Another quote from Lombardo's report. Training is a critical component for LVMPD as it is for for any law enforcement agency, unquote. My comment on that? I agree that training is critical. However, those trained personnel were not deployed prior to the massacre, where they could have saved lives that night. And from what I read in officers' reports, Lombardo, that were released, and yes, Lombardo, those same reports who you had your attorneys fight to prevent their release in court, those officers who were rifle certified, like I said, didn't even have the weapons with them. Another quote, LVMPD trained and conducted joint exercises with the Clark County Fire Department, the Clark County Medical Examiner's Office, Clark County Emergency Management, local jurisdictions, and the FBI, unquote. Lombardo, 3 years later today, October 1st, 2020, why don't you produce all those training records, including those training records pertaining to the FBI? Do those records confirm that FBI training scenario to take out a sniper from an elevated position in a hotel high-rise? Just thought I would ask. I know we're never going to see any of this. Another report from Lombardo's report. LVMPD's events planning section strategizes and coordinates the staffing of special events, unplanned events, protests, and dignitary visits throughout Las Vegas and the Clark County, Nevada area. LVMPD's events planning section is unique among law enforcement agencies. In preparation for this event, meaning the Route 91 event, the events planning section held 3 planning meetings and conducted a tabletop exercise involving over 30 hours of planning. During the table exercise on September 8, 2017, the events planning section discussed ingress, egress to the north of the venue, evacuations, and wind concerns, unquote. My comment on this. The Las Vegas Metro SWAT team has been deployed for dignitary protection, and they have been deployed on New Year's Eve celebrations on the Las Vegas Strip for years, prior to the Las Vegas Massacre. I know that for a fact because they were at my hotel at the Riviera when I was Director of Security and Surveillance there for almost 10 years. However, even though the police knew that a threat existed from a sniper attack from an elevated position, SWAT was never deployed at any of the Route 91 music festivals in 2014, 2015, 2016, and 2017. Apparently, the LVMPD never conducted a threat assessment to the open-air venue, or if they did, they ignored the possibility of a sniper attack from an elevated position. Lombardo, 3 years later, we would still like for you to release the LVMPD's Incident Action Plan that was prepared by the Events Planning Section for the 2017 Route 91 Harvick Music Festival. Some closing comments. Once again, as has been the case numerous times in this country, those in government whose job it is to protect the public safety and who we put our trust in to do just that, resort to cover-your-ass mode and excuses when they fail. Such was the case with the October 1st, 2017 Las Vegas Massacre that left 58 people dead and almost 500 wounded by the actions of a single active shooter who was allowed to fire for well over 10 minutes without one police officer countering his gunfire. The tragedy that occurred that horrible night was the result of complacency, incompetence, and negligence, and falls on the shoulders of Clark County Sheriff Joe Lombardo, the head of the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. Lombardo failed to protect the public, and we saw the aftermath. Jim Moran, the former CEO of MGM Resorts International, the owners of the Mandalay Bay Hotel and the Las Vegas Village grounds, the site of the Route 91 Harvest Music Festival, was no less responsible. MGMRI allowed Paddock to bring his arsenal of weapons and ammunition into the Mandalay Bay Hotel unimpeded, along with his vehicle that contained explosive materials. As a result, MGMRI had no choice but to settle out of court with the victims. No amount of money, though, can ever pay for the pain and suffering MGMRI has caused to countless families. MGMRI was negligent. They know it, and they will always know that. The American public is sick and tired in the wake of tragedies to hear the same thing over and over again by lying, corrupt politicians, that they are going to make changes to assure that such a tragedy doesn't happen again, and that they are now better prepared if such another incident occurs in the future. It's nothing but an excuse to cover up for their incompetence and lack of leadership skills, and the result, as it was on October 1st, 2017, was the death and wounding of innocent concertgoers. Both the LVMPD and MGMRI had 15 years to prepare after the attacks of September 11, 2001. They failed miserably, to say the least. After the massacre, Lombardo and other politicians thought that catchy phrases like 1 October and Vegas Strong would somehow lessen the pain of it all. It did not. It ended up being a new marketing ploy. Vegas Strong was the result of a terrible tragedy. No business entity should be profiting from that slogan. After the massacre, politicians used the airtime to get their faces on camera standing behind Lombardo like anything they had to say meant anything to anybody. And of course, hours after the massacre, Aaron Rouse, the special agent in charge of the FBI Las Vegas division, assured us all that terrorism was not involved. That is still a remarkable statement to me. No way the FBI could have known that soon. There are still questions surrounding the Las Vegas Massacre that I would like to have answers to, and more likely than not, may never be answered. Considering the horror that occurred that night, nothing like Las Vegas or any other city in this country had ever experienced before, I give a thumbs up to all the Las Vegas Metro police officers who were on scene that night, along with the fire, rescue, and medical personnel, and the countless civilians who banded together to save lives. Hopefully, the lesson learned from October 1st, 2017 is that the words, "never say it could not happen," will never be spoken again. Thank you for listening.